Welcome everyone again to the University of New Mexico Law and Mental Health Series, weekly discussions of practice and science by experts in behavioral science and the law, hosted by the University of New Mexico Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences, along with the New Mexico Behavioral Health Services Division. I'm Anthony Perillo, the Forensic Psychology Training Director here in the Division of Forensic Behavioral Sciences at the University of New Mexico. For our talk today, if you have any questions for our presenter, make sure you enter them in the Q&A box anytime you feel comfortable. Know that we do hold the questions until the end. We do try to get to as many as we can. It's not always possible to get to all of them, of course. If you are pursuing continuing medical education credits, there will be a sign-in sheet that will be in the chat box shortly. If you are pursuing APA continuing education credits, that will be posted again in the chat box in the latter portions of the talk. Make sure you check the link before you close the webinar and make sure that you save your certificate after completing the survey for your CEU credits. We don't have access to those certificates after the fact. A recording link and the PowerPoint slides for this presentation should be available sometime later in the week. And as a heads up, we will be taking 2 weeks off for the week of these holiday seasons. We will be returning with Law and Mental Health on January 9th, 2024, when Kaiser Marshall will be discussing issues related to autism spectrum symptoms and disorders and competency evaluations. But let's focus on this week at the same time. I'm thrilled to introduce you to today's speaker, our final speaker of 2023, who will be discussing racial, ethnic, and cultural identity issues in court clinic evaluations. This is Dr. Lara Guzmán. Dr. Guzmán is a forensic psychologist in the Forensic Services Division of the Massachusetts Department of Mental Health. Over the past 15 years, she's worked in the juvenile justice system and in adult correctional and inpatient forensic evaluation services across the state. Currently, she works as a designated forensic psychologist at the Metro Boston Adult Court Clinic team. Dr. Guzman-Hosta is active with the American Psychology and Law Society, currently the chair of the practice committee, and also a member of the Broadening Representation, Inclusion, Diversity, and Global Equity Committee, the Bridge Committee. She has authored and co-authored articles on cross-cultural issues and psychological assessment and conducted international, national, and local presentations and trainings on cultural issues in forensic mental health practice. She is also Boricua, born and raised in Puerto Rico, and completed her graduate work at Carlos Albizu University in the San Juan campus. She is an alumnus also of the Center for Multicultural Training in Psychology. Dr. Guzmán, Lara, on behalf of the University of New Mexico, it's an honor to have you. Thankful for you joining this series, and I look forward to you sharing your expertise on this really important issue with us today. I will go ahead and throw it over to you now.
Thank you so much, Dr. Perillo, for your invitation, and I'm thrilled to be here. Just a couple of things I wanted to share before I get started. Just disclosures that I don't have any conflict of interest, no relevant financial interest in this presentation, and also that the views expressed are solely mine and not that of the university or my employer as well. To go over the learning objectives, the topic of my presentation is the consideration of racial, ethnic, and cultural identities in court clinic evaluations. At the end of this presentation, you should be able to describe the complex roles court clinicians can have within the criminal court setting, to identify at least 2 models and tools to gather race, ethnicity, and cultural data. You'll see that as I go over the presentation that I will use, I will refer to this as REC for short. So I'm trying to mean race, ethnicity, and culture. Finally, we'll discuss beyond the data how to incorporate the rec identity context into recommendations and consultations in a court clinic setting. It is my personal hope that this presentation raises more questions and curiosities for you than answers, and that it further propels you to build your own identity context toolbox as an evaluator. I have spent the majority of my professional life as a psychologist in Massachusetts, despite being born and raised in Puerto Rico. And for that reason, the context and experiences that I describe will be in that context as well. So just keep that in mind. This beautiful picture is a time lapse of Boston. And as Dr. Perillo mentioned, I am part of the Metro Boston Court Clinic team. In preparation for my presentation today, I reached out to several colleagues who work in court clinics across the nation so that I could gather a sense of how other court clinics work. As in many other states, court clinics in criminal courts in Massachusetts conduct evaluations such as competence to stand trial, criminal responsibility, aiding sentencing, involuntary civil commitments to psychiatric facilities under various contexts. Actually, one key difference between Massachusetts and other states is the idea of same-day evaluations. So for example, we conduct what we call same-day evaluations or screens especially for competence to stand trial and criminal responsibility evaluations. And that means that an evaluation gets ordered and then there is an expectation by the court that it is done fairly quickly, so before the end of the day for sure. And that includes testimony, and if the person subsequent to the evaluation is probably going to be recommended to be hospitalized, that a report will then be forwarded to that facility and to the court. So across the state, we have a teams of social workers as well as psychologists conducting work in our court clinics. And psychologists are the ones in our state who conduct competency and criminal responsibility evaluations under Mass Chapters 123. So in a handful of cases, referrals are specifically requested for example, extended outpatient competency and criminal responsibility evaluations. And there might be times, for example, when after you conduct a screening in a time-limited fashion, you may decide that further evaluation in an outpatient setting makes sense, and you may recommend that. But for, I would say, the bread and butter of court clinicians, it is kind of, especially psychologists, in terms of criminal evaluations, is to do these like same-day screenings. Just to give you a sense of what it may feel like to work in a busy court clinic, for example, I may walk into my office suite, and good morning to my colleagues and such. And then I hear the doorbell, and there might be, for example, officers from the local police force and a corresponding social worker who want to speak to me about a case. And so let's assume that they come in and tell me about a case. Of course, this case that I'm going to refer to throughout the presentation is not a real case, but mostly like a compendium of various situations I've encountered over the years. But for the sake of being able to provide this example, let's say that the name of the individual that is the focus of this request is called Juan Colon. Okay, he's a 21-year-old man, was arrested after violating a harassment prevention order. that his girlfriend had on him. And they described that the police has intervened at the family's address multiple times due to noise complaints because he appears to be screaming at night, singing, and not sleeping. They had not previously involuntarily hospitalized him because they did not feel that he met the criteria for, a likelihood of serious harm to self or others. They tell me that they only could speak to his teenage sister because his mother does not speak English. And that yesterday his ex-girlfriend called the police after friends told her that Mr. Colon posted a video on Instagram posing with an automatic rifle, laughing and calling her name. And that friends told her that this was posted on social media. And then reportedly the police came to his house and that he had barricaded himself in the upstairs bedroom with furniture and was yelling that to police officers that he had knives and a gun and that he, if they tried to come in, that he would kill them. Officers reported that they attempted to de-escalate the situation with their corresponding clinician as well as a hostage negotiator. But that these were not successful. So a tactical team sprayed tear gas and they came in and they subdued him. Eventually, they took him to the emergency room where he stayed overnight, was evaluated medically and psychiatrically, and then was brought into court in the morning because there was an expectation that he would be evaluated by a forensic psychologist. And so the police tell me that they've already spoken to the district attorney on the case and told them that they should consider raising the issue of competence to stand trial because of their concerns about the gentleman's mental health. So I take notes of all this information and I decide that I'm going to go out to the court session to figure out who the duty attorney is. So that I can relay this information and figure out if an evaluation is in fact going to be ordered. When I speak to the duty attorney, they tell me they've already met with the client and that they were going to raise the issue of a potential lack of competency because they were concerned about the client's state of mental health. And then let's say that armed with all that information, I go back to my office to make some phone calls. I want to call the hospital to see if I could get some information about what happened last night at the hospital. But as I'm sitting down at my desk, the bell rings again, and I realize there's another attorney at the door who tells me that there's another evaluation that has been ordered on a different client who's in custody as well. So this is kind of a snapshot of not just the time demands, but the multitasking that occurs with same-day evaluations in the court. Some of the advantages, though, of working in a court clinic is that you're kind of embedded in the community and in partnership with agencies and individuals who know and serve and work within the community, and you get to observe the day-to-day workings of the court and how dispositions get implemented. But given the high level of acuity of the population that we work with, the time constraints and other factors, I often hear from forensic evaluators that there are challenges to bringing up issues of race, ethnicity, and culture, that often those aren't addressed unless there's an obvious description of those in the referral process. Nonetheless, I do think that these are essential issues to address, and that's part of what my presentation is about today. So, what are some reasons to consider race, ethnicity, and culture? So, well, it is important to address because it's part of our guidelines and ethical part of our ethics, right? The specialty guidelines for forensic psychologists that were drafted in 2013, as well as the race and ethnicity guidelines by the APA, which were drafted in 2019, They established that psychologists should explore, understand, and reflect on the impact of their positionality, that we are tasked with attempting to limit or correct the negative effects of race, ethnicity, and cultural bias. The race and ethnicity guidelines from the APA indicate that psychologists must consider whether indigenous and ethnocultural sources of healing are an important part of the mental health journey for a person as well. And also the relevant literature, especially in recent years in forensic mental health, indicates that an evaluee's perception of their own identity is important. The literature also encourages individuals to look into how society, the impact of how society perceives a person's identity. And then, for example, in articles published in 2021 by Helbroom and his colleagues, as well as Ricks, Romain, and Kavanaugh in 2018, discussed the complexity of making sure we examine not just the data, but the relevance of the data and the impact it has in communicating that data. Also, other reasons are that as a collective, our society is struggling to respond to systemic and historical racism. The national headlines are distressing, but one does not need to stray far from home to see that these historical injustices persist. The first image here is an actually multi-part investigative journalism project by the Boston Globe that addresses racial disparities in housing, sports, healthcare, higher education, and leadership in Boston. And the second headline actually highlights the racist murder of an Afro-Latino man in Belmont, which is a city within the jurisdiction of one of the courts I cover. So given these historical inequities in Massachusetts, there's been efforts to implement change. And for example, in 2016, Chief Justice Gans, then the Chief Justice of Massachusetts, he commissioned a study indicating that Massachusetts needed to have a hard look at the justice system, and announced this collaborative study with Harvard University to examine race and ethnicity related disparities in the criminal justice system in our state. Eventually, the study indicated that Black and Latinas are overrepresented in the criminal caseload, that they have higher rates of much more severe dispositions, and that there were substantial race-related disparities in the initial charge severity, which then impacted disparities in terms of sentencing down the line. In 2018, the Massachusetts governor, then Massachusetts Governor Charlie Baker, signed a criminal justice reform bill that issued groundbreaking reforms in various areas, such as increasing funds for pretrial diversion, reforming the cash bail and fine systems, eliminating mandatory minimums for low-level nonviolent drug offenses, and also reforming the ability of people, for example, criminal records, the ability of people to be able to expunge a record that occurred, for example, before the age of 21. So in the context of that, of all of those very difficult things, in the forensic division of the Department of Mental Health, a work group was developed to work on race, ethnicity, and inclusion, or REI, issues within our system, and specifically in forensic mental health processes in our state. I am part of that work group, and we as a group developed the ERICAS tool. That's tools, the acronym stands for assessing race, ethnicity, culture, acculturation, SOGI tool. And SOGI stands for sexual orientation, gender identity, and gender expression. And the ERICAS tool is a tool that guides the user across data gathering and offers questions towards organizing and integrating the information. And as part of the ERICAS, I worked in a kind of a sub-project on basically developing a process for time-limited evaluations in the exploration of rec in those specifically in a court clinic setting and time-limited evaluations. I invite you to think of this model not as a checklist, but actually as a process that kind of guides us through data and questions to ask ourselves throughout the process. And one of the most important processes to think about is data gathering. And when you think of data gathering, especially in a time limit setting like the court clinic, we don't want to put more pressure on ourselves to, for example, we don't have the same amount of resources and time to say, do a battery of tests to figure certain things out. But what I'm encouraging folks to think about more is just having an internal toolbox. That is your toolbox of knowledge, of certain questions that may be helpful and relevant within certain contexts. So one of the first tools and the first things to think about is there's a self-assessment, right? So we think that all of the guidelines, ethical guidelines, tell us that we need to take a look at ourselves and explore our own identity. Exploring your own areas of race, ethnicity, and cultural identity, how it impacts your life and your position relative to what is privileged in our society, and gives you a growing awareness of how it impacts an encounter with a client. I would recommend the self-assessment described in the book by Pamela Hayes in 2016. The book is called Addressing Cultural Complexities in Practice. And you might have heard of the addressing model. And there's a similar model called the Camino model that was published by Silva and her colleagues, which has, it's a similar concept of an acronym that stands for various areas to assess. So for example, addressing covers age and generational influences, developmental and other disability, religion, ethnicity, and racial identity, socioeconomic status, sexual orientation, indigenous heritage, national origin, and gender expression. And the Camino model overlaps with addressing in many ways, but it has a special emphasis on the experiences that occur to immigrants. So for example, it adds lines of inquiry such as acculturative stress, migration history, idioms of distress and resilience, native language, communication preferences, and country of origin. In conducting the self-assessment, Hayes encourages you to complete the information for yourself and then have an asterisk next to the areas where you hold privilege. And it encourages you to be attuned to those areas where you tend to be more privileged, because those are the areas where we have the least awareness. And let's use the example again of Mr. Colon, the case I discussed earlier. Let's suppose that prior to interviewing Mr. Colon, I am informed by his attorney that his mother and sister are in the courtroom and that they would like to speak with me. I am able to speak to his mother and sister in Spanish. And in the context of gathering history, I asked them about their cultural and ethnic background. And as I'm asking that question, Sarah angrily asks me in English why is their background something that I'm asking about, and what does it have anything to do with this? And she tells me that she's only interested in sharing information related to her brother's mental health and getting him the help that he needs, and nothing related to their culture. Consider this scenario and the questions that would come up for you. Having recently done the self-assessment, I reflect and consider my privilege in terms of citizenship status, and how a question like that may land on somebody who may be concerned about being persecuted due to their immigration status. Having reflected on this, I pull back, provide more context for why I asked the question, and also show them respect and say that if they don't feel comfortable answering that question, that they of course do not have to, and that I'd be happy to focus on the information they feel comfortable sharing. And let's assume that Mom and Sarah process this information and decide to spontaneously share their cultural and family history. They tell me that Mr. Colon and his family came from the Dominican Republic when he was a toddler, and that he seemed to adapt well, that he was the first in the family to speak English fluently, did well in school, was an honor student, even did well through his parents' divorce. Even he was preparing to be a graphic designer. But towards his senior year in high school, he started spending less time with his peers, became much more reclusive. And the mother mentioned that all he talked about were spending time in church, religion, and they even mentioned that he seemed much more religious than they ever were in his family. That the family used to go to church sometimes, but not as much. And they even referenced that the pastor in their church had become concerned with how focused he was, and that they had advised him to spend some time outside of church and socialize with his peers. The family became much more encouraged when he started dating his girlfriend, or his ex-girlfriend now. He finished high school. However, he grew more and more possessive, accusing his girlfriend of cheating and behaving inappropriately. Eventually, she broke up with him, and because reportedly he was leaving threatening messages, she filed a restraining order, which was granted in our court. Mom reports that the son stopped leaving the house, would stay up at night, would barely sleep during the day, and that he appeared preoccupied with the end of times, that he failed his college classes, and she could just hear him at night talking to himself, and sometimes he will open the window and yell, which is why the police had been coming to the house. The mom believes that the police just does not want to help him, and they're afraid that if there's additional incidents, that the police may kill him. They stress that he does not belong in jail, and that they believe that he needs to be in a hospital setting. So, examining considerations. Well, this refers to asking the person questions that elicit their own explanations and perspectives. of their own problem or identity. So I usually start by telling the person that I will ask them some questions about their history so I can understand who they are. And I want to make a note here to reflect on our training here, because a lot of the times I hear a lot of people thinking that they don't have the time to ask about this question, especially in a court clinic setting where we are so pressed for time and have limited resources. We need to get to the bottom of the issues as quickly as possible. However, when I ask these questions, I don't feel like I am doing something extra or doing double the work. I feel like a lot of these questions kind of do double duty, help me understand a cultural context and also help me understand clinical information as well. So it allows me to get additional information about clinical and forensic questions that I may have. So if we think of, for example, the article that Hilburn and colleagues wrote on identity context, some of the questions that they suggest with regards to asking about race in the person's own context are, say, for example, in the case of Juan, you might ask a question like, when you are asked about race, what do you usually say? And let's say that one says Dominican, I guess, right? So he's giving you some information about sort of how he sees himself and his identity. If you follow that up with, and let me just put in all the resources here so you guys can see. If you follow up with the DSM cultural formulation interview questions, I may ask him something like, what are some aspects of your Dominican identity that are important to you? And let's say that he says, I don't know, my family, I guess. I can follow with, okay, what are some aspects of your background and identity that cause concerns or could be difficult? If in this case, let's say Mr. Colon says the police is always after me, they're trying to arrest me. I see the way they look at me, they're always after me, but I'm not fooled. I know what they're trying to do. They're giving you information that allows you for more follow-up. Okay, so you may ask, like, what do you think is about your background that has made you feel a target from the police? And let's say in this instance that Mr. Colon says, well, it's because I'm Black and they don't want, they don't think I should have special abilities like God told me I have. So you have now various levels of information here, both clinical and of cultural and racial ethnic relevance. Another helpful question here that I've used from the DSM-5 toolbox, a cultural formulation interview, to understand the sort of the cultural context in which this information comes into play. What do others in your family or in your community, friends, what do they say to you that they think is causing this problem for you? Let's say that Mr. Colon says, no, I'm not crazy. They just want me to get help because they've also bought into this, and maybe they are being racist too, and they don't believe me. All they do is the pastor is stealing money from people. I have been exercising and trying to get healthy, and I'm working on it on my own. And that it leads you into another line of questioning from the DSM-5 that's really helpful, because this particular line of cultural formulation interview questions help you to get at how the person views themselves, how they think their community views them, and how what are some community strategies for coping. So for example, you may ask, okay, some people have different ways of dealing with these problems. How have you dealt with this problem? And how do you think that's going? And so it may help you understand ideas about, say, what traditional Western medicine has done or has not done for this person, and what are some beliefs or that they have in terms of what they think will be helpful for them. And let's say that in the context of this, Mr. Colon shares with you that he believes that the police has wiretapped his house, that they are listening to him, and that that's why he's mad and screaming, because he's basically yelling at them to stop. And he talks to the surveillance and because he thinks he's just taunting the police because they're listening to him. Okay. And one note I would make here too is that in this cultural context, especially in the dominant cultural context, we tend to think of communication as ideal communication as that which is straightforward, to the point, and sequential. That when communication does not occur that way, we may assume that the person is tangential or disorganized, etc. And while that may be the case, there might also be cultural styles of communication that are different than dominant discourse that we need to be attentive to. I know this because in my culture, for example, communication is not just about discussing data, but it's about an emotional experience. And that I've actually seen quite a lot in the court clinic setting, especially when we see people who have recently just been arrested. And when you ask them, for example, in the context of competency about what their charges are or what they're accused of, oftentimes they just want to tell me their experience. Well, I was sitting here and then the police knocked on the door, and they just want to tell you the whole experience. That may not necessarily mean that they don't know what the charges are or they don't know what is being said about them in terms of accusations. But part of the process for them is to be able to say that story from beginning to end. And what I've observed is that oftentimes working with criminal defense attorneys who are of a different cultural background than their clients, especially if they have a privileged or non or white background, that they often actually stop their client, interrupt them, and say, look, we don't want you to talk about the facts of the case. And so there's a lot of back and forth between the client wanting to say their story, the attorney interrupting them, and it kind of goes on for a while, and it can be at times quite frustrating for the client. Let's say, for example, in the context of Mr. Colon, that this is something that's happening, right? That Mr. Colon is trying to tell his story and his attorney has interrupted several times. Right. So another topic to think about is racial trauma. And one of the tools to address racial trauma is the racial trauma scale. There are other scales who address these issues, but this is one that's come up more recently. And again, I'm not suggesting that that you administer the whole scale, but after becoming familiar with the scale, it does give you a sense of important areas to inquire about if the issue of racial trauma, like in Mr. Colon's case, is relevant. In this particular scale, there were 3 factors that were quite highly loading. And that was the concept of lack of safety, negative cognitions, and difficulty coping that were strongly related to PTSD criteria in the DSM-5. And that all of these are in the context of racial mistreatment of a person of color. So depending on the situation, like for example, in Mr. Colon's case, questions can be asked about whether the person feels the world is unsafe, whether they feel, concerned about going out in public, watching their surroundings for dangers. They feel they're going to be mistreated or misrepresented when they speak, humiliated, etc. When you ask about racial trauma, don't be surprised if a person does not want to disclose information. They might feel uncomfortable sharing that, especially if there is a difference between the race of the evaluator and the person, as they might. And this response is actually quite adaptive. Like, folks may not want to share about traumatic experiences across from somebody who looks like somebody who's aggressed upon them in the past. So the evaluator, if they feel it's important to address these issues, they may want to preface their questions by giving them context and normalizing the potential feelings that may arise when they hear the questions, and validating their concerns, encouraging to ask questions, etc. So now that we've gathered this information with Mr. Colon, let's think about some of the important aspects of integrating this information. So let's see that you're gathering, you're kind of closing the data gathering with Mr. Colon. He's conversing with you and able to remain engaged to some point when you're gathering, the historical data. But then when you get into competency, this dynamic occurs with the attorney that I mentioned, where Mr. Colon is trying to tell his story. He's interrupted by the attorney. At some point, Mr. Colon becomes very frustrated with his attorney, gets agitated, curses at the attorney, and basically tells the attorney that he's just like with the police. He's part of the issue. He's discriminating against him, and that he feels that he's out to get him as well, and he's done with the interview. And he starts banging on the door and says, to the COs that he wants to go back to his cell and no longer wants to participate in the interview. And let's say that as you're leaving the interview, you hear Mr. Colon yelling in his cell, singing, and court officers tell you that he's been doing that throughout the morning. Let's remember the task, right, in the court clinic. That's to gather as much relevant information as you can, to raise as many informed questions as you can, to either allow you to rule out the forensic issues or to determine if further evaluation is needed. In this case, given all the information and the questions raised, what data do we have associated with the functional legal capacities? We have Mr. Colon having difficulty focusing on the interview, having difficulties communicating with his attorney, and providing answers associated with the competency interview, but becoming frustrated with his attorney when he's not able to say things in the format that he wants to say them. He appears to have pressured speech, a high level of activity. We have the reports of the family that talks about his behavior at night. So nonetheless, there remain questions about whether his presentation is better explained by a disconnect between, say, his communication style and the attorney's communication style, whether his ideas regarding the incident and the police are delusional, whether it's consistent with someone who has experienced racial trauma, or both. And I would encourage folks to be able to hold both things at the same time. Maybe Mr. Colon could be having legitimate mental health issues and also have experienced this trauma and have these very relevant experiences as well. And then, of course, in the court clinic, one has to determine whether further evaluation in an inpatient forensic mental health facility is warranted. And if you determine that that is the case, why? What are some questions regarding, for example, risk management that come to mind? For example, one of the questions that have to be addressed in our evaluations here in Massachusetts, it's whether strict security in a facility, like if we're going to recommend inpatient for their evaluation in an inpatient forensic setting, does it have to be a facility that offers strict security, or can it be in a less restrictive setting, like a Department of Mental Health facility? So we need to think about what is the likelihood that this individual may pose a safety risk for himself and others in a less restrictive facility. Historically, we know of stereotyping and bias associated with men of color specifically. And for example, in an article published by Deb Pynels and her colleagues in 2004, they looked at Massachusetts court clinics and strict security recommendations by court clinicians, and they found a significant number of Black and Brown individuals were referred for strict security dispositions at higher rates than their white counterparts. So it's important to take into account that historically these are issues that have occurred. And then when communicating with the court about the case, we want to make sure we are mindful of only addressing those aspects that are solely relevant, so as to avoid salience effects and biasing impacts. So, you know, and saliency effects means that the most recent information might impact a person's and may trigger biases in judgment, and that we need to be aware of that when reporting the information. So again, part of the issue here is not necessarily reporting all the data that we obtain, but actually being able to obtain the data so that we can decide its relevance and is to the forensic questions, to the clinical and dispositional aspects of our work, and then to be able to tease apart what we share and what we don't share after we've determined what is relevant. And then with regards to the issue of evidentiary challenges, you know, there may be questioning in a cross-examination related to whether your questions regarding race, ethnicity, and culture have been generally accepted in the field or tested or subject to peer review and things like that. And then the article, for example, published by Helbert and their colleagues, indicate that ways to deal with these kind of questions are to explain that exploring race, ethnicity, and culture, it's part of the historical information that we all gather as part of data gathering in forensic mental health evaluations, and that there is a substantial body of research, for example, if we're talking about racial trauma and things like that, that considers the impact of race and racial prejudice on individuals' sense of self and development in terms of traumatic responses. Other things to think about, especially in the court clinic context, is in terms of recommendations. So let's say that Mr. Colon is being referred to an inpatient facility for further evaluation. We want to make sure that the questions that we have that are relevant in terms of race, ethnicity, and culture, that we address those questions, not by providing an answer, but what we name, that we discuss and delineate what are some relevant questions that folks in that facility should be exploring, so that we facilitate this handoff process and help create a narrative for this person, at least in terms of exploration when they go for further evaluation. And also because there is a kind of a feedback loop in the court clinic where you may have Mr. Colon, for example, return to the court clinic several months later, maybe for an update on his evaluation, or maybe because other issues have arisen, and you want to be able to follow up on those issues. My apologies. Another issue in terms of dispositions, before I pause for questions, I wanted to mention that we want to make sure that when we are thinking of recommendations, for example, in our courts, inpatient versus outpatient, strict security versus not strict security, that we adapt that to what are some important aspects of race identity and culture. So for example, there might be, let's say not Mr. Colon, who has some substantial issues, is probably going to be held in custody, etc. But we also have people who, if they're able to, if they go, say, for example, in an inpatient facility, they might lose substantial supports they already have in the community. They might lose their housing. They might lose other aspects. So we might want to think of the dispositional impacts, which are tied to race, ethnicity, and culture, because we know that that person has already struggled to be able to obtain those supports. And then having a decision that we may make, a recommendation we may make, may have a substantial impact on what happens to them after their inpatient hospitalization. And I guess with that, I will leave it for questions. I know there's a lot to say on that, but I see that it's 8 till the hour, and I want to make sure that I address any questions. I do have a list of references here. Of course, I have a lot more references. So if anybody is interested in my complete list of references, I'd be happy to forward it to you guys in the email I have here. Thank you.
Well, wonderful. Thank you, Dr. Guzman, on that very thorough and practical discussion there, with a lot of different considerations broadly and in the room of how we might address these issues. We do have a couple of questions here. Of course, if you have additional questions for Dr. Guzman, feel free to enter those into the Q&A box. Make sure you check the CEU links in the chat box if you're pursuing CEU credits. Those links are posted and available there. And there is the QR code for the post survey, and also an alternate route to those links. Somebody asked if you felt it was important, or at least to what degree it is important, that an examiner and client share in common, at least to some degree, racial, ethnic, and cultural backgrounds for a fruitful interview to take place.
That is a great question. I think that earlier in my career, when I started doing more of this work, I think I erroneously assumed that when I shared the background with a certain aspects of my background with a person, that may lead to sort of a general common understanding. But what I've come to realize is that, if you look back at the tool that I was discussing in addressing, for example, there's so many different areas where you may have some areas in common in terms of areas of privilege and areas of experience discrimination. You may actually forget to think through some of your awareness on those other areas. So while there is some advantage, for example, in terms of undeniably with the language, I can see that is definitely an advantage. The fact that I speak fluent Spanish and I don't need to use an interpreter is a huge advantage for me. But I would say that I've really thought through about not making assumptions that because I share certain aspects of my background with the person across from me, that means that they will understand me or that I should make assumptions about them.
Really gets back to that intersectionality issue, and the relative weight of those different identities can really change depending on the context of the interview and the other background issues, of course.
Yes.
Somebody asked in their particular area that they've had many presentations addressing this important issue, and was curious if there was any evidence of these issues being considered specifically in cases like competency to proceed and NGRI cases. They add don't juries or judges just focus on what competency is and what is insanity? Would love to know if there are cases where these issues are taking these important considerations into account.
Yes, I think more and more those issues are being actually discussed in courtrooms. I've been present from, for example, folks in, say, a commitment hearing are questioned about their positionality and whether they have a different positionality than their client and whether that they have reflected on that their impact during the interview. I have observed, for example, attorneys bring that up at cross-examination in competency hearings. For example, if you think of the case of this gentleman that I discussed, it's sometimes it may be hard to tell, for example, if we're thinking about competency, is the client unable to really have a straightforward conversation because they're manic and disorganized? Or is it that their style of communication is not compatible with that of his attorney, and whether an intervention needs to take place so that there is a higher level of understanding and compatibility with the attorney? And those issues directly bear on the issue of, say, competency. I can't think of the top of my head on issues of insanity or criminal responsibility directly, but I do know that often the question arises on sort of the divergence between, is this mental illness or is this a cultural issue? And sometimes it could be both. A person may have, say, delusional ideas about, say, the police wiretap their whole room. That may sound potentially like a delusional idea, but that does not discount that they've also been the subject of persecution in the community that has led to racial trauma, and that both can coexist and impact the person's diagnostic presentation and impact sort of the behavior at the time of the offense, for example.
I immediately popped to mind some certain police cultures in other countries where certain beliefs about that might actually be normalized or based on personal or vicarious experiences of other people. So yes, a really important consideration. Somebody added, in their jurisdiction, incompetency must be due to a mental disease or defect. However, they've been able to make recommendations to defense and to the court to accommodate cultural differences. I'll say in New Mexico here, and specifically our statute for competency does not explicitly require a mental disease or defect under the law. So these issues come up. Even furthermore, it's just the broad capacity and does not specify legally if it has to center on a mental disease or defect. Somebody else asked, yes, it's caused me in my 1 year here, it's caused a curveball in certain how you explain things to courts and all that because of that lack of mental disease explicitly in the statute. If a defendant is from a different country and lacks knowledge of the US legal system, to what extent do you attempt to learn about the legal system from their country of origin? Do you find it helpful to try to relate US legal systems to systems of their country of origin? Or any tips on providing education about the US legal system for somebody in that context?
Well, it's such a great question. I think it would depend on whether I am doing a more in-depth evaluation or whether I'm doing a same-day screening. I think, though, what I try to do is that I am attuned to those differences, and I try to express curiosity about things. So, for example, this has come up a lot when I work with Latina individuals who may, for example, when you ask them about their understanding of the different roles of court participants, it comes up a lot, for example, that their understanding of what a judge is and what a prosecutor is at times is quite aligned, in that sometimes there are certain countries in which prosecutors serve as judges in certain capacities, or that there's prosecutors and judges, for example. So I try to understand what their experience is within the criminal justice system in their country. And I may preface my questions like, okay, I heard you about that, But tell me more about what you've experienced. If they say, well, I've just heard about this, and say, okay, so that might be a difference. However, in this court, this is actually how this person is supposed to behave. And these are some of the differences. And try to stay attuned to whether the person is able to kind of comprehend and have a sort of a discussion about differences. So that, because basically you're not trying to do a pop quiz, you're trying to sort of see, okay, can the person is able to understand and benefit from education. And so I do try to offer a lot of education when I can in the context of these evaluations as well, so that I can observe that the person is able to benefit from it. And that may include education on the differences between the two legal systems.
Dr. Guzman, Lara, thank you so much for your helpful discussion and thorough information here. I know I'm picturing a lot of this being really helpful in our system here in New Mexico, and it certainly applies to a number of different issues that people across the U.S. and beyond experience in their evaluations. So thank you so much for all this helpful information, as well as helpful insight in how to put this into practice.
Thank you so much.
Yes, that wraps up this week and this year of the Law and Mental Health series. We will be returning on January 9th when Dr. Kaisa Marshall will be discussing issues related to autism spectrum symptoms and disorders and how those relate to competency evaluations. Until then, we hope you have a fantastic holiday season and a prosperous new year, and we look forward to seeing you again for a lot of other presentations in 2024. Take care.